And you are muted, Bethany, sorry.
Thank you everyone for joining. This is our last session on day one in our concurrent sessions. And I'm very excited to introduce some dear colleagues of mine who will be presenting on stakeholder engagement to disseminate rapid and responsive messages. Mika, Hillary Lum, and Jenna Reno. I'm going to save as much time as possible and not read lengthy bios for each one of them. Jenna is a communication and dissemination scientist. She was with the University of Colorado for a number of years, but is joining the RTI International as a senior digital strategist with the Center for Communication Science. Dr. Lum is a geriatrician, palliative medicine physician, and health services researcher. And Mika is a senior research assistant and doctoral candidate in health services research at the Colorado School of Public Health in the Department of Health Systems Management and Policy. And they all work together along with a number of others on a large team on our MAB Colorado project, which they'll be presenting today. So I'll turn it over to all of you for your presentation. Thank you.
Hillary, are you going to start us out today?
Oh, sorry, you must not be able to see the chat. It's funny, we're in a virtual world. But Jenna, I pass to you so that we can use all of our time. Thanks for everyone joining us. Please do use the chat as you have any questions or comments, and we will have a chance to have a bit of interactive discussion.
Great, thanks. All right, so our learning objectives for this session are first to demonstrate how to use stakeholder engagement in the context of rapid and responsive dissemination. I'll describe the choice of use and lessons learned from 2 stakeholder engagement methods that we collaborated on, including community engagement studios and town halls. And we'll also talk about the use of an online tool to choose an evidence-based stakeholder engagement method. And demonstrate how you can also use that same tool if you're not familiar with it. So to start out, we have a couple of questions for you to answer, if you would, in the chat. So our first question is, what are your key barriers to rapid stakeholder engagement? And I'll give everyone a minute to put your responses in the chat. Right. I'm seeing a lot of things come through here: time, funding, community partners, finding people, administrative issues. Yes, all of these are things that we are going to get into today. And we won't necessarily have solutions to all of these things, but hopefully we can help get this conversation started, and maybe some other people will have some additional examples or ideas for solving some of these barriers. All right, a second question to think about is we're interested in knowing what methods or tools you have used for rapid stakeholder engagement. See some examples of in the chat, social media, leveraging existing relationships or community networks, all of these things. And again, this is a great introduction for what we're going to talk about today, because yes, as we'll get to, having some of these things already in place was really important to being able to rapidly perform stakeholder engagement in this example. All right, so in this particular example, we use stakeholder engagement to perform rapid iterative prototyping. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this term, we did a series of designing of communication materials, and I'll get more into that in a moment, where we went to different community partners, different participant groups, and we iteratively designed our materials in a rapid time frame, making changes after each group that we met with. And so the project I'm going to share with you today is our MAB Colorado study, which is entitled Implementation and Real World Effectiveness of Monoclonal Antibodies for High-Risk Outpatients with COVID-19. This was funding that CCTSI received and was led by Drs. Ron Sokol and Edith Gende. So I'm just going to share a small part of this very large and busy project with you today. So for those who might not be familiar with monoclonal antibodies, it's a treatment for COVID-19 for after people have tested positive but are not hospitalized, so are exhibiting mild to moderate symptoms, but who are at high risk of developing severe COVID-19. So this treatment needs to be given within the first few days of illness, and therefore it's necessary to rapidly identify eligible patients. So this treatment was first authorized by the FDA back in late November, early December of 2020. And so for a long time, it was the only outpatient treatment available for patients. And so at the time we received funding, there was very low uptake of this particular treatment. And so that was one of the challenges that we were attempting to address with our dissemination strategies, is how can we increase uptake of this effective treatment for COVID-19. So we used a dissemination planning framework, starting with goals and objectives, and then using stakeholder engagement to identify strategies surrounding core audiences, messaging and sources, packaging, distribution channels, and evaluation. And we aligned those different strategies with the implementation strategies that were currently in place for uptake of monoclonal antibody treatments. And so some of our dissemination objectives for this project were to partner in a variety of ways with community, clinical, and public health stakeholders to understand community access facilitators and barriers. We had an emphasis on ensuring equitable access. As we all probably know, access, especially to novel treatments, is not always equitable. And so specifically in light of COVID and disparities that we're seeing in terms of the burden of COVID, we wanted to make sure that we had this emphasis on ensuring equitable access. And so a necessary part of this was just building awareness and providing resources to those who are in most need or who face the greatest barriers to access. And so in order to identify what type of stakeholder engagement methods would be ideal for this rapid iterative type of dissemination and design project, we use dicemethods.org, which is a web tool that you can go on, and we'll get to this more later, but we can use it to define the criteria of your particular project or research to identify the types of stakeholder engagement methods that would be most suited to your resources and the needs of the project. And through this, we identified a couple of different potential stakeholder engagement methods. The primary one that we used was community engagement studios. So community engagement studios consist of a brief presentation from the researcher. Typically, they're used for research projects that are looking for stakeholder engagement. And so they start with a presentation by the researcher and then focus on 2 to 3 questions to the stakeholder group to elicit input on the research projects. And these sessions are consultative in nature. So we adapted this particular methodology to create design studios. So we were looking to design communication materials, public facing, to raise awareness about monoclonal antibodies. So we did start with a brief presentation from the research team, from myself, on monoclonal antibodies and some of the barriers that community members needed to be aware of. And then we used 2 to 3 questions to the stakeholder group that that I'll show you in a moment, and used a series of iterative co-design strategies to design a communication campaign. And so these sessions were collaborative in nature. So our community engagement studios took place between May and August of 2021, and we met with a variety of community groups. So our first round of community engagement studios were with multi-demographic representatives from a stakeholder advisory panel that advised on the larger scope of the MAB Colorado research project. We had a round of community engagement studios with Native American community members, Spanish-speaking community members, rural Coloradans, and healthcare providers. And so you can see here an example of the types of questions and responses that we got from our community engagement studio surrounding important information and concerns. So the community experts' role in these particular engagement studios were co-design of messages, materials, and distribution strategies tailored to the given audience, so to their community. They provided comment and suggestions on improvements to messages and materials, and then recommended communication channels and helped us make connections to community champions. And so here's an example of how we elicited ideas and co-design strategies from these community engagement studios. So we asked about message sources and spent time brainstorming who are trusted messengers, who is considered credible and reliable by community members, or we asked participants to help us identify visuals. So we asked them to insert ideas for pictures, images, or other visuals we might use. And through this, you can see we got a lot of ideas that we definitely were not able to execute all of them. And so part of the challenge here was to identify where our resources and abilities aligned with the suggestions that we were getting from community members. So for example, we would have loved to have a sports figure who could have, been a spokesperson for monoclonal antibodies, but none of us in our social networks knew a sports figure. And so that was an excellent idea that we were not able to execute. So here are some examples of the various materials that came out of our MAB Colorado communication campaign. You can still find them on our website, mabcolorado.org. A second methodology that we used was town halls. So town halls are pretty much what many of you probably think of them as, where you invite individuals from specific geographic areas for a public discussion, and they can be used to identify a list of potential research topics or ideas, and typically involve voting to prioritize those topics. So our adaptation here was that specifically we were interested in working with immunocompromised Coloradans, especially as those are a key demographic in need of monoclonal antibody treatments. And so for this town hall, our agenda included a presentation on monoclonal antibodies. We invited community members to tell their stories. We had a public discussion about monoclonal antibodies. And then at the very end, we asked for feedback on our existing communication materials, and we incorporated the feedback and ideas we received into the generation of new materials. So this was a flyer that we had previously created, and you can see we customized it specifically to immunocompromised individuals, and it was important for them. They asked us to specifically call out different types of conditions. In terms of distribution, we launched a paid media campaign where we push people to our website where they could find information and resources on accessing monoclonal antibodies. We had Facebook and Instagram ads. We ran web banner ads, Google search ads. We used direct mail postcards in areas that had high target populations. And then we also had radio partnerships in the Denver metro area, as well as in Western Colorado. We also worked with community partners around the state, local public health agencies, as well as regional health connectors. We worked with a group called Project Mosaic, who ran a an entire PSA specific to Native Americans in Colorado. We worked with the Denver Health and Family Services as well as COVID Check Colorado to distribute materials to potential patients. So health equity was really a guiding principle here. So a few considerations in planning and our selection of strategies, we really wanted to make sure that our strategies allowed for the underserved and underheard voices to have a seat at the table. We were able to leverage our existing relationships, but as I mentioned, it had already started coming out in the chat when in areas where we didn't have existing relationships, we weren't able to execute. So if you go back and think about that list of communities, you know, we would have loved to add to that list, but didn't have existing relationships for us to leverage. Our research project and processes also had the same limitations as the broader system in terms of being able to distribute monoclonal antibodies, and we weren't able to solve some of those distribution problems or access problems beyond, you know, providing information and trying to work with community partners as well as possible. And then there were challenges and limitations in engagement of some communities. And so our effects were only as good as our relationships and as time allowed in this case. So some main lessons learned is, one, primarily to use discretion. We had a lot of input, as I said. Some unexpected opportunities will come up, and just being able to understand the resources and how they align with stakeholder input. Ultimately, this had to be anchored in trust. You know, again, it's really hard when you have community partners who are bringing you and saying, like, this is what we need, and having to push back and say, we don't have the resources to be able to execute on that, as much as it is a great idea. But ultimately, you know, our response was to say, we hear you and we have limitations. And also, co-design doesn't mean that all the decision-making power goes to one group. That is that, again, the community members who participated with us ultimately, you know, we took their input, we incorporated it, but it was a co-design process and not a community-led decision-making process. And so certainly there were trade-offs with our time and considerations. Hillary, I see some things that have been popping up in the chat. As I've been talking, I haven't had a chance to look at them. Are there some questions that have come up that I can answer?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jenna. We invite people to put into the chats. Most of the comments are actually mine, giving additional information about the community engagement studios and town halls, our use of a visual illustrator. Someone asked a question about incentive for participation. While people may be chatting in, Jenna, I am interested in what do you think that we also could take from what we experienced as researchers doing rapid stakeholder engagement to apply to future projects? What's a key takeaway that if you knew at the beginning, you would perhaps do differently or even the same?
Oh, that's a good question. And I wish I would have prepared an answer for it in advance. I mean, I think there's always a balance, right? We had a lot of ideas going in of what we wanted to do and what we thought would be effective, and opportunities where we needed to pivot and go in a different direction. A lot of them surrounded building a website. And so that was something that was pretty new to me. And so I think, you know, having a plan for maximizing your resources, but also being prepared to pivot when needed.
Yes, absolutely. I think that in COVID overall, and then monoclonal antibodies in particular, and then also true in this aspect of developing messages, there were pivots because the context was also rapidly changing. And so, Claudia, I'll answer this question as Mika also gets set. We're now going to take a deeper dive into dicemethods.org so that hopefully each of us can walk away with tangible familiarity with this and even some thoughts on how you might incorporate it into a current project you're working on. So I will continue to answer questions in the chat, and I will turn it to Mika.
Thank you, Hillary. So for the last approximately 12 minutes before we wrap up, I'm going to walk us through the dicemethods.org website and do sort of some mixing and matching with some of the options there to showcase kind of how we arrived at some of the methods that we selected for the Map Colorado project, but also demonstrate how you might use it in your own work, whether it's rapid or regular speed. So can I just get a thumbs up? Can everybody see the dicemethods.org homepage? Okay, super, thank you. So we're gonna go ahead and start this find engagement strategies. And I guess before I get too far into this, I will just note that we've sort of walked through an example of this on the handout for this session. So that's a reference point, but there's a lot more information than we could squeeze on the front and back of a single page. So I'd encourage you to explore the website at your leisure and just take advantage of all the great information that's found there. So we'll start by finding engagement strategies. And to begin, you're going to see the prompts here that really encourage you to think through some of the things that Jenna touched on related to our project. So considering, what is the purpose of the stakeholder engagement for your project? Is it around planning and co-design and really kind of getting people in at the ground floor? Are you looking more to engage stakeholders for the purpose of dissemination, things like that? Again, considerations and sort of operationalizing some of the constraints or resource limitations that Jenna alluded to. So sadly, knowing a professional athlete does not appear on this list, but there is an opportunity to select some things that are maybe more tangible constraints that you might want to consider. Number of interactions. So again, what's sort of your overall timeline and how frequently and over what period of time might you engage with your stakeholders? How much time do you have with your stakeholders as a sort of a quick interaction versus prolonged exposure? And then who do you have on your team? What's your staffing and expertise? Do you have somebody who can build a website? Do you have qualitative folks? Do you have quantitative folks? What are sort of the limitations based on who you have available to actually do the work? So we'll go ahead and get started. So here, like I said before, what is the purpose of your stakeholder engagement? And so at what stage of your project are you really looking to engage folks? Is it around planning? Are you implementing something that has been previously designed? Or are you really looking to disseminate things? So for today, we'll go ahead and select Disseminate. We'll go to the next question. And here it's going to ask you, why do you want to engage stakeholders? So within the topic of dissemination, there are a number of reasons why you might want to bring your stakeholders in. So whether this is translating research into practice, whether this is describing findings in a way that stakeholders can understand and use, or disseminating findings to relevant audiences. And that can be a lot more broad than, clinical practice, for instance. So we'll go ahead and we will disseminate findings to relevant audiences and head to the next question. So here's where things, in my opinion, start to get really fun. And this is really the kind of interactive portion of the tool. But these little sliders will allow you to, like I said, kind of operationalize the constraints that exist within your project or your work. And so, it may be that you have sort of monthly meetings that may be like 10 or more times. So if we slide things on, you'll see that the options below sort of begin to animate in a way that allows you to kind of pop out the ones that are maybe going to be more relevant to the project at hand. So again, budget constraints, maybe we'll restrict our budget a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and make this look a bit more like what our project looked like, excuse me. And we had shorter interactions with folks. We actually did have a larger budget. So we'll go ahead. So you'll see as we sort of modify these different inputs here, that some of the tools that we use, so for example, the community engagement studio and the town hall meeting sort of rise to the surface as like potentially relevant methods and approaches here. But what's maybe useful to highlight is that it's really a menu of options. And so, you know, we had certain constraints and certain parameters within which we were operating. But community engagement studios and town halls certainly were not the only strategies that we could have selected. And so I think that the tool really does a nice job of highlighting that you have a lot of different options. And so, you know, it's not sort of a one size fits all. So what I will also mention here is, you know, I alluded to sort of the depth of information that's in the dicemethods.org tool. So taking community engagement studios as an example, if we click on this, it's going to pop out sort of a small descriptor of what each of the things is. But if we go ahead and click on more information, it'll actually take you to a page with much more detailed information. And so this, again, I think is a great option for evaluating the various choices that you might have. So highlighting budget, time per interaction, type of interactions, the time frame, the workload, which is always a useful consideration. Describes in more detail the engagement purposes, how you might apply it. It also shows where it may be less useful, which is also an important consideration when you're trying to weigh pros and cons. Number of key characteristics and resources, including the personnel. So here's really where you could start to dig more deeply into what exactly are each of the strategies and methods and how might it fit within the context of your project, sort of beyond the basic, you know, budget, time, and time per interaction. So that is available. There's also more detailed information how to actually go about doing any one of the methods, pitfalls, tips, variations, some examples, and other resources. So that level of information is available for each of these methods that show up on the dicemethods.org page. We could relaunch the tool and you could do a similar exercise if you are at the beginning of a project and you were doing project planning. I won't walk through this in as much detail, but again, the point here is just to highlight that there's really a lot of resources available for selecting the strategies that you might use. There's great language that can go into grants if that's the phase that you're at. When you're thinking about how do you talk about what you did, there's great language to use from this web page. And I've spoken very quickly, and so I think I've blown through my time a little more quickly than I anticipated, but I'd love to open it up to questions, or alternatively, if anybody has an example project or something they're thinking of where we might be able to walk through another example, I'd be happy to do that as well.
Thank you so much. And with that, we welcome additional questions or comments. Thanks, Laura. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, but I can actually read this if you want. Yeah, I have a project where I want to get input from researchers and community partners and a pretty broad and diverse group. And I think your tool will be really helpful for thinking through some of the methods. So yeah, I just wondered if you had any experience with that or what you'd recommend.
Yeah, I think that none of these tools are specifically designed for researchers, like as a perspective, and people who are community partners. And yet I think that many of them can well meet the opportunity to hear from people from different perspectives. So I think a bit of it is a choice of, do you want to do the engagement all in the same activities, or do you want to do them simultaneously, perhaps in parallel? So that I would recommend as one decision. And then if you are thinking about how to, perhaps some would call it community-based participatory research, where there's a desire to interact in the same space, to co-create even the research questions or the study design or particular aspects of your study. Then I think on dicemethods.org, one of the evidence-based sources are liberating structures. So off the top of my head, that's one I think about in terms of ways to introduce conversations so that you are, as the planner, aware of potential power differences and power dynamics. And there are tools then to be able to hopefully maximize perspectives from different places. I think one commonality as I've looked through liberating structures is the opportunity to have everyone be able to provide their input, and often that's written first, so that there's a place where whether you're a slow cooker or a microwave, everyone has a chance to get their ideas and input together and then shared. I'm happy to have others add. And Laura thinks, I think different Laura, same Laura. I think Laura, you still have your hand up.
Yeah, oh, sorry. I just,
Okay.
can you hear me? Am I double muted? Okay,
You're good.
yeah, that was funny. I think there were two Lauras trying to comment at the same time. Problems of having a very common name. Anyway, yeah, this is really cool. We've been using the community engagement studios for a while without realizing that it actually had a specific name. So I feel good to know that we weren't just making something up, because it's actually been working really well with us. So I really appreciate you all. I'd seen Kwan et al. Paper, so I've been kind of going through and working with the tool a little bit, but it was nice to see an example of how you all used it. And yeah, this is a really great session. It was really useful for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing also. And Laura, Milko, I'd love in the chat if you can even chat in, sort of, have you provided an incentive, and how did you decide what that is, related to an earlier comment. I think that this was my first experience using a community engagement studio. It was great to see the rich examples of community engagement studio in the literature, and then for us to think through, how did we adapt it to the specifics of our project, the specifics of Rapid, the specifics of our local resources and what we were able to do. And they were both planned adaptations and then things that we just did on the fly. As an example, we proposed in the grant that we would do community engagement studios with healthcare providers and have them be multiple times, like we did with community partners. And that really just didn't fit the paradigm for healthcare providers. Input was faster, and it was one meeting only rather than a series.
Could I ask another question? Well, I don't want to interrupt in case other people have it, but Katie Trinkley mentioned in the chat that one of her issues was the time and the number of iterations needed to do it well. And I feel seen. Do you all have kind of a perspective on how that can be addressed?
Jenna, do you want to take that? And I think this we'll have to wrap up, but
Sure. I think it depends on what it is that you're designing or iterating. And so I don't know that there is any like standard metric for other than, getting to a point where you have something that is useful and usable by your intended end user. In our case, we were, for better or worse, the communication campaign was fairly simple. So we were able to do this and just have like 2 sessions with each of our communities. But, certainly if we wanted to plan and devise more complicated distribution strategies, we would have loved to push more into some of that community engaged work, we would have needed more sessions for that. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but it depends.
I would just add to like that can be part of the kind of expectation setting piece of like we hear you and also we have constraints, but also we recognize that you have constraints, right? And you're not going to be on the phone with us every week reviewing every iteration of every product that we're producing. And so I think it's really that sort of open communication and going both ways as well to kind of manage what is the degree of participation that you're expecting from your stakeholders.
Thank you all so much for this presentation. It was really cool to see the presentation on the dicemethods.org tool that has been something that's been featured at every single one of our CopperCons, starting with you are all the intended users of that tool. And in year 1, we focused on product features. Year 2, it was user testing, and now you get to see the end product. And so now our dissemination is complete, I suppose. But thank you so much for demonstrating this, the use of community engagement studios in our MAB project. It was a very fast project. I'm sure it wasn't perfect, but it did the job. And so I hope everyone comes back for CopperCon Day 2 to learn all about system science and de-implementation tomorrow at 10 o'clock Mountain Time. And I hope you have a good rest of your afternoon.